recording on. All right, so new stuff for today. Today we're going to talk about evolution and succession. And succession is the process. Succession is the process by which community evolves over time. It's how that community changes as far as how the organisms living there change, how the plants change. Maybe the types of animals are different. So succession is the process by which a community changes over time. And this happens through evolution. It happens through evolution. The animals evolve and adapt and change. The plants evolve, adapt, change. And that creates or helps the entire community evolve. So we're going to look at two kinds of evolution today. We're going to look at primary evolution and secondary evolution. Two types of evolution. Okay, and it depends on the environment. Primary evolution starts in lifeless areas, such as an exposed rock or a glacier or an area after a volcanic eruption when there's just cooled lava. There's no animals, there's very little plants, there's pretty much nothing there. There are no previous organisms living here. And if we look at your example over here on the left, okay, there was nothing here at first. It evolved into some single-cell organisms, eventually into multicellular organisms. As they grow and they adapt and they change, they become more complex. We also have secondary succession. In secondary succession, organisms are already currently there. This could happen after a wildfire or a hurricane, after some kind of natural disaster. So there's already some type of community there. It got destroyed by, let's just use the example of a fire, and that community has to rebuild. Secondary succession is the most common type of succession that we have or that occurs. I'm going to show you an example. Okay, if you look at the picture, we had a community, we had a forest, a community. There were deer and birds and trees and plants and all of that. Then all of a sudden one day, there's a large wildfire. After the wildfire, it looks like this. There's some burnt trees, maybe a few places where there's a little bit of green grass, but burnt soil, there's pretty much nothing left. So this community has to start rebuilding. The first thing to come back are those annual plants, those plants that die in the winter and come back in the spring every year. Some grasses, some weeds, that kind of thing. Once there's grasses and weeds there, you'll start getting some of the smaller animals that live there and can feed off that, like a mouse or bugs. After those start growing, the next thing you're going to have is larger grasses and perennials. some flowers, some small shrubs. It takes about 5 years before you start getting any kind of shrubbery or small trees. Trees can take up to or over 100 years to completely mature. So it takes a while after you finally started getting these little trees at 5-6 years after the fire until they're completely mature. Then, eventually, 150 or so years after this wildfire, they're going to reach climax status and become a climax community. What that means is that this community is now fully developed and it's stable. It's not going to change unless there's some kind of outside factor like another fire. Now I'm going to put these definitions down on your note board as well underneath our chat. That way, if you need to go back and look at them, they'll be there for you. But once they reach this climax status, it's fully grown, it's not going to change without an outside factor, it's stable. That happens in both primary and secondary succession. Primary succession would usually take longer to get there, but eventually both of these environments are going to reach a climax status where they're stable, they're fully grown, they're developed. Nothing's changing unless there's some kind of outside force, like an earthquake or a hurricane or a forest fire. Both primary and secondary succession have those small pioneer species, the original first things that are very simple, that will eventually evolve and change and add more complex organisms. And both primary and secondary are very slow, gradual change. It can take a couple of 100 years for a forest to reach climax status, to be totally stable. It could take even longer than that for a forest, a new forest, to completely grow out of a glacier. So this is a slow process over a long period of time. Obviously, if somebody came back after the forest fire and started replanting trees immediately, it's going to speed it up. But if we let it happen naturally, it could take a very long time. So, two types of succession, primary and secondary. Primary happens when there was nothing there previously. Secondary happens where there were organisms at one time, after a forest fire, after a hurricane. If we cut down a forest of trees, we're logging in the rainforest and just leave it there, it's going to take a few 100 years, but it will eventually start growing back. Questions about this part? You're good with the two types of succession? So primary is when there's nothing there to begin with. This would be like if a volcano erupted and all of the cities at the bottom of the volcano are covered in that lava. After the lava cools and it's just volcanic rock, there's no plants, there's no trees, there's no animals, there's nothing there. So we're going to have to start basically at the very beginning. Think about like the Big Bang. Okay, if you believe in the Big Bang Theory, we started as single cellular organisms that will eventually evolve into multicellular organisms and things a little bit more complicated like a jellyfish, and it will keep going. So there's a video that this video is going to talk about processes that cause these species to evolve. All right, in order for there to be succession and for the environment and the community to change, animals, people, plants, all the living organisms have to evolve. And again, you know, we still can't screen share in Jigsaw today. So I'm going to share the link with you in the chat box. I'm going to give you about 6 minutes. I want you to take time and watch that video. Come back and give me a green check when you're finished. Take just a minute and go ahead and tell me or explain what you learned. You can put it on the chat, on the whiteboard. It should be unlocked for you to write on. You can also put it in the chat box, but tell me what you learned. What was the video about? What do you know about the reasons for population change? So he talks about the change of a population. Okay, he used the example of cards and talked about, you know, you start with the same number of black cards as red cards, but over time that could change, and there are some reasons for that. The first reason is your population could shrink. If you've got let's say there's 100 fish in the pond, right? 100 fish in the pond, and all of a sudden a toxic chemical gets dumped in the pond. Okay, there's runoff from a factory and toxic chemicals get dumped. Your population could shrink. The amount of fish in the pond is now much less. That definitely changes the population. That also may change the types of fish. Okay, if all the catfish died, now there's, let's say, a brim are left. So it changes the makeup of your population as well as the number. Mating can also change the makeup or the frequency of your population. To use the example, if nobody wanted to date redheaded people, okay, then eventually that's going to die out. If, let's say, girl birds prefer a certain color of male bird or a certain shape, then the ones that they don't prefer are eventually going to die out. And I circled the wrong thing there. The next one he talks about is mutation. If a new gene gets introduced into the gene pool, it could cause a mutation. That's something different. It looks different. It has different characteristics. Movement. If the local pond dries up, then the deer and the birds and the mice and the bugs that live near the pond are going to have to move and find a new water source. That's the same with people. You live near a river and all of a sudden your river dries up, you're going to move somewhere else to get water. Nowadays, that's not as important because we have things like indoor plumbing and we dig wells. But especially back before all of this kind of technology, when people had to go to the local river or lake to get their water, that was very important that they were close to water. These four things can all impact your population and but the last one he goes over, natural selection. Natural selection means survival of the fittest. If you're not a good fit, you're going to die out and not survive. Natural selection leads to adaptation. That's what we looked at in the lab this week. Okay, the birds who had a beak built for survival or who could adapt and figure out a new way to eat that food, they're going to adapt, they're going to survive. So these 5 things impact our population, the number of organisms, the types of organisms that are there. They help the organisms to evolve, which will overall lead to succession. Do you guys have questions? Do you understand that there are 2 types of succession? That all of these 5 factors influence the change in population, which will influence evolution and succession. I'm going to give you some time in Canvas to look at the succession and extinction. That's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to put it on the board for you. Canvas, today is the 30th. Today is the 30th. Oh, that's weird. Today is the 30th. I want you to do the warm-up, the instruction, and then there is a summary. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes. I believe you guys get done at 2:05 today. Yes, 2:05. So we've got about 15 minutes. Now we're going to come back that last 2 or 3 minutes and wrap up before I get you out of here. So take these next 12 or 13 minutes to get started in your Canvas. The more you do now, the less you have for homework. Take some time now while I'm here to answer questions or help you with something. I'll put a timer on the board and we'll meet back here in about 12 minutes to wrap up before you leave for the weekend. on Tuesday, okay, or before Tuesday, before you leave, make sure to complete the lab. Make sure to work on and finish today's stuff in Canvas. I'll hang out a few more minutes if you have questions. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day and have a great long weekend, guys.